Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe to our channel, hit the bell icon.
There are nights when sleep does not arrive all at once, but drifts closer like a boat approaching shore. This was one of those nights, and Morty, lying with his head tilted against the edge of his pillow, felt himself balancing between waking and dreaming. The room was quiet, yet not silent. Shadows moved with the faint hum of distant electronics, and somewhere in the corner, a flicker of light pulsed like a heartbeat. He thought it was the reflection of the television, but when he opened his eyes fully, the screen was dark. Still, the flicker remained. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and turned over, expecting it to vanish. But it grew instead, a shimmer spreading across the blank screen like morning mist. The television, which only hours ago had been left off, seemed now to breathe with its own faint glow. Morty didn't feel afraid. If anything, the glow made him feel oddly calm, like being held by something both strange and familiar. He let his eyelids droop again, as if trusting the screen to tell its own story. The images that rose there were not shows, not channels, not anything he had ever tuned into. They were fragments, a sandwich half-eaten resting on a school desk, clouds drifting past as if painted on glass, a pair of shoes left beside a creek with water still running over smooth stones. Morty knew these weren't things he had watched. They were things he had lived, though he had not thought about them in years. The television had become a mirror, reaching gently into his own memory, pulling out the forgotten pieces and arranging them like soft constellations. Morty shifted beneath his blanket, whispering to himself that this was just a dream. But dreams usually slipped away quickly, fading into nonsense. This felt different. Each image lingered, slow and deliberate, like someone humming a lullaby he almost recognized. And beneath that lullaby was the quiet sense that there was more than memory, more than dreams, more than the small life he thought he had been living. The glow expanded, and the fragments of memory began to overlap with moments that could not have been real. Morty saw himself sitting beneath the same creek's water, not as a boy but as an older version of himself, his hair a little longer, his shoulders a little heavier. He saw himself laughing beside Summer, though in this version they were grown, and their laughter was the kind that carried both joy and sadness. He saw Rick, too, not bent over bottles and gadgets, but sitting silently with his hand resting on Morty's shoulder, his eyes almost soft. These were not memories, not yet. They were possibilities, whispered in colors that bent like liquid light. Morty felt his chest rise and fall, a rhythm slower than usual, as if the images were teaching him how to breathe. He didn't fight them. He let them pass through him, each one leaving behind a quiet ache, a question he didn't yet know how to ask. The television seemed to sense his surrender, deepening into more tender visions, his mother smiling on a tired evening, Summer drawing little stars on a notebook when she thought no one was watching, his father speaking words that were clumsy but earnest. Every figure in his family glimmered here, not perfect, not polished, but real, woven together in a fragile web that held him even as he floated further into the dream. It was then that Morty realized the screen wasn't trying to entertain him. It wasn't a show. It was a remembering, a soft unraveling of what it meant to belong. He felt it not just in his eyes, but in his body, the way one feels the warmth of a blanket or the coolness of a breeze. Each flicker was both a story and a feeling, carrying him through currents of nostalgia that were too gentle to resist. He thought of Rick again, and this time the glow dimmed. Shadows settled across the screen, and Morty felt a tug in his chest. Rick was not always there. Sometimes he was only the sound of the garage door closing, sometimes the smell of metal and smoke on his coat, sometimes just silence stretching longer than it should. The screen showed those silences too, but without cruelty. They were part of the pattern, as necessary as the brighter threads. Morty's eyes filled slightly, though he didn't cry. It was the kind of heaviness that made him breathe deeper, the kind that softened rather than broke him. He wondered if anyone else in the world could see what he was seeing. He wondered if Summer's television would ever flicker this way, or if his mother's dreams carried the same quiet mirrors. The thought didn't frighten him, it only made him feel less alone, as though this strange gift was both deeply personal and quietly shared. Perhaps everyone had a screen inside them, hidden just beyond the edge of waking. The glow began to blur, the images dissolving into swirls of gentle light. Morty felt himself drifting, but not into empty sleep, more like sinking into a deeper room of memory, one where time itself slowed to a hush. His body was heavy, but his mind was light, filled with drifting echoes of laughter, footsteps, and unspoken words. He understood none of it fully, but he understood enough that there was something more to family than what was said aloud, something carried in gestures, pauses, and glances. Morty let out a small sigh, almost smiling, as the final shimmer on the television dimmed to black. He didn't need to hold on tightly. The story wasn't finished, but it didn't need to be. For now, it was enough to have felt the edges of something larger than himself, something that would guide him even when the screen was dark. As the last flicker faded, the night returned to its quiet state. The hum in the walls settled. The shadows rested where they were. Morty, half asleep, pulled the blanket closer and whispered nothing at all. And yet the silence answered him. He did not know yet that this was only the beginning. He did not know that the flicker would return, stronger, weaving through the days ahead. He only knew that sleep was carrying him gently now, as if the world itself had promised to hold him until morning. And so Morty slept. Morning came gently, as if it did not wish to disturb the night that had only just closed its eyes. Morty stirred beneath the weight of his blanket, still carrying fragments of the flickering dream that had settled into him like embers. For a few seconds he could almost hear the hum of the television, though it was now silent and dull, its screen blank in the pale light of dawn. He blinked, uncertain whether to believe what he had seen or felt, and decided, in the quiet way children often do, that perhaps the truth didn't matter. What mattered was the way it had made him feel, heavy with questions, and yet strangely comforted. That day unfolded slowly. Morty moved through it as though some invisible rhythm guided his steps. He carried the flicker with him, not in sight, but in spirit, and found himself noticing things that usually passed him by. The way sunlight caught on the edges of the kitchen window, the tired but determined way his mother held her coffee cup, the exact pitch of Summer's voice when she called out from another room. Each detail seemed charged with meaning, as though life itself had hidden messages tucked inside ordinary folds. When Morty was younger, people often said he asked too many questions. Not loud questions, not the sort that drew attention in class, but soft ones. He would stare at the ceiling before sleep and whisper to himself, "Why are clouds so heavy if they float? Why do people smile when they are sad? Why does silence sometimes sound louder than words?" No one had answers that satisfied him, and yet he kept asking quietly, as if the act of asking was more important than finding. That morning, sitting at the table with his cereal softening in milk, he asked his father a question that seemed simple enough. "Dad, do you ever wonder if there's another version of us, like living different lives somewhere else?" Jerry blinked at him, halfway through buttering toast, and chuckled nervously, brushing it aside with a shrug. "Buddy, I can barely keep up with this version." Morty nodded, pretending to accept the answer, though inside he knew it wasn't enough. He wasn't really asking about versions in space or dimensions. He was asking about choices, about the echoes of what might have been. At school, the questions followed him. While teachers scribbled notes on the board, Morty found his gaze drifting to the window. Clouds moved lazily overhead, and he imagined them as enormous ships carrying unseen travelers. He wondered if they looked down and saw the world the way he had seen it in the television dream, fragmented but deeply alive. He wanted to ask his classmates if they ever felt this way, but the words never seemed to fit. When he spoke, it always came out too simple, too awkward, as though the depth he carried refused to be shaped into sentences. Still, some people noticed. There was a teacher once, older, with glasses that always slid down her nose, who paused when Morty asked why the moon didn't fall. She didn't laugh or dismiss him. She only said, "That's a good question," with a softness that made Morty believe it mattered. He carried that moment with him like a small lantern, long after the lesson had ended. At home, he often sat with Summer in the late afternoons when the air grew heavy and quiet. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they argued about small things, whose turn it was to change the channel, who had eaten the last snack. But then, in the spaces between arguments, there were moments when they shared something unspoken. Morty once watched her doodle tiny stars on the edge of her notebook, tracing them absent-mindedly, as if they were more real than the page itself. He didn't say anything, but he remembered it. The way one remembers the rhythm of a lullaby without ever singing it aloud. These small quirks, unnoticed by most, began to shape Morty. He didn't know it yet, but his habit of staring too long at clouds, of listening more deeply than speaking, of holding on to fragments others forgot, these were not weaknesses. They were the beginnings of something tender, a skill not of power but of presence. He was learning, without instruction, how to stretch himself quietly into the lives of others, to feel what they carried, even when they did not speak of it. The flicker of the television still haunted him, but not in a frightening way. It returned at night sometimes, just as his eyes grew heavy, offering brief flashes, an older Summer, a quieter Rick, a family laughing together around a table they never owned. Each glimpse faded quickly, but Morty carried the residue through the day. He didn't need to tell anyone. It was enough to know that somewhere, whether in dream or possibility, there were versions of love he had not yet touched. As weeks passed, Morty's questions deepened. He wondered less about facts and more about feelings. Why did Rick sometimes leave without saying goodbye? Why did his mother sigh before speaking, as if weighing every word against exhaustion? Why did his father try so hard to seem cheerful, even when his eyes gave him away? These weren't questions for teachers or books. They were questions meant to be felt, not answered, and Morty was learning to hold them in silence one evening, while the rest of the house busied itself with noise, dishes clattering, television humming. Morty sat by the window with his chin resting on the sill. Outside, the sky was painted with fading light, the kind of twilight that makes everything look softer, less defined. He watched as stars began to appear one by one and thought of them as tiny windows into other lives. He whispered, just to himself, "Do they wonder about us too?" His voice was barely audible, but in the stillness of that moment, it felt like the world had heard him. He didn't realize it then, but this quiet way of wondering was shaping his future. While others sought answers in noise and certainty, Morty was learning to live with mystery. He was learning to find comfort in not knowing, to treat questions as companions rather than burdens. The flicker had planted something in him, a seed of awareness that would grow, not in spectacle, but in stillness. As night folded in again, Morty lay down with the same gentle ache he had felt before. The television remained blank this time, offering no visions, no dreams. But he did not feel abandoned. He understood, in his own quiet way, that silence could be an answer too. The questions would wait. The flicker would return. For now, it was enough to simply breathe, to feel the softness of the night pressing against him, and to carry the strange comfort of knowing that even in his smallness, he belonged to something vast, and so once more, Morty slept, this time with questions curled beside him like old friends, and the faint sense that the story of his life was only just beginning to unfold. Rick's presence in Morty's life was never like the steady rhythm of a clock. It was more like the flicker he had seen on the television, appearing and vanishing, unpredictable, sometimes too bright, sometimes only a shadow on the wall. After nights of quiet dreams and unanswered questions, Morty began to sense his grandfather's shape in the silences between words. Rick was not always there in body, but his absence was never empty. It pressed against the house like weather, changing the air, leaving Morty wondering when the door would open again and what version of Rick would step through it. There were days when Rick's return was loud, full of clattering bottles and muttered equations that Morty couldn't follow. On those days, he would storm into the garage, working furiously on some device while ignoring everyone else. Morty would linger nearby, not daring to interrupt, yet unwilling to leave. He watched the way Rick's hands moved with restless precision, how his eyes darted like lightning, always searching for a solution to something unseen. Even in the chaos, there was a strange beauty to it, and Morty felt drawn to the way Rick's mind seemed to burn brighter than the world around him. But then there were other days when Rick came back softer, quieter, almost fragile. He would sit at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring into his glass as though it held a map no one else could read. Morty sometimes crept down the stairs to see him there, illuminated by the dim yellow light, shoulders hunched, eyes heavy. He never knew whether to speak or stay silent. Often he chose silence, sitting a few chairs away, letting his presence be a kind of wordless company. Rick rarely acknowledged him, but sometimes, just before rising, he would glance over and give the faintest nod. That single gesture was enough to make Morty feel as though he had been seen. As Morty grew, these contrasts in Rick's presence became a part of the rhythm of his childhood. He learned not to expect consistency, but instead to hold on to fragments, the rare moments when Rick explained something to him in a way that almost sounded like teaching, or the unexpected times when Rick would press a strange gadget into his hands without warning, muttering, "You'll figure it out, kid." Morty didn't always understand the devices, but he understood what they meant: a quiet gift, an invitation into his grandfather's world. The flicker from the dream lingered in Morty's mind during these encounters. He began to wonder if the strange images he had seen, the older version of himself, Rick resting a hand on his shoulder, were not just possibilities, but messages. Perhaps the television had shown him a truth that Rick himself could never say aloud. That beneath the noise, the inventions, and the distance, there was something unspoken, a connection Rick could not bring himself to name. Morty held on to that thought whenever Rick disappeared into the night, the garage door echoing shut like a sigh. One evening, as Morty sat in the garage watching Rick tinker with wires and metal, he asked softly, "Do you ever, wish things were different?" The question hung in the air, fragile and trembling. Rick didn't look up. His hands kept moving, his eyes fixed on the machine. For a long moment, Morty thought he wouldn't answer. But then, without turning, Rick muttered, "Different doesn't stick, Morty. People don't change. Worlds don't change. You just keep moving." The words were sharp, but Morty heard something beneath them, an ache, a tiredness Rick couldn't hide. Morty didn't argue. He simply stayed where he was, watching the sparks of light leap from the machine, wondering if Rick noticed how often Morty stayed beside him, even when there were no answers to be given. That was how Morty learned his quiet skill most fully, not by speaking, but by being present, by listening not only to words, but to the silence they carried. Summer noticed it too, though she rarely said anything. She sometimes teased Morty, calling him Rick's shadow, but there was no cruelty in her tone. Deep down, she understood what Morty was trying to do, what he needed to do, to stand close to someone who was always drifting, to anchor them without chains. It was a strange kind of love, both heavy and light. The nights stretched on like this, a cycle of arrivals and departures, noise and silence. Each version of Rick left an imprint, and Morty carried them all. The brilliance that dazzled, the weariness that sagged, the rare moments of softness that shone brighter than either. He did not always understand his grandfather, but he understood the space between them. That space, though sometimes painful, was also where their bond lived. Over time, Morty realized that his questions were no longer just about clouds or stars. They had become about people, about the fragile architecture of connection. He asked himself why Rick, with all his knowledge and inventions, still seemed loneliest when surrounded by family. He wondered why love often hid itself inside silence, why care was shown through gestures instead of words. He wondered too if perhaps his own role was not to solve these mysteries, but simply to hold them, like a lantern that never went out. Even when the path was dark, one night, unable to sleep, Morty returned to the living room where the television sat. It was dark again, still and ordinary, but he found himself staring at it anyway. He whispered, almost as if the screen could hear him, "Show me again." Nothing happened. Yet as he sat there, breathing softly, he felt the memory of the flicker stir inside him. Not outside this time, but within. He realized then that the visions had never really left. They were part of him now, woven into his way of seeing. He leaned back, letting his eyes grow heavy, and thought of Rick, of the shadow and the light, the absence and the presence, the contradictions that formed a man who was both broken and brilliant. Morty didn't know if his grandfather would ever change, or if he even needed to, but he knew this: he would keep being there. Not with noise, not with demands, but with the kind of steady presence that spoke louder than words. The night deepened, carrying Morty slowly towards sleep. Somewhere in the quiet, he thought he heard the soft hum of the television again, though when he looked, it was only his reflection, staring back. He smiled faintly, pulled the blanket around his shoulders, and let the silence guide him. The questions would wait, as they always did, and the story, his story with Rick, was still unfolding, and so, with thoughts drifting like clouds across the sky of his mind, Morty closed his eyes and rested, knowing that even in shadows, there was light enough to carry him forward. The silence that had closed around Morty after nights with Rick began to feel less like emptiness and more like a hidden classroom. It was in those pauses, those stretches of quiet when no one spoke, that Morty started to notice something stirring in himself. It wasn't dramatic, not like the gadgets Rick built or the glowing portals he sometimes glimpsed. It was subtle, so subtle that he didn't recognize it at first. It was the way he could stand near someone, even without words, and feel what weighed on them. A heaviness in their shoulders, an ache behind their eyes, a tremor in their voice that no one else seemed to hear. He thought, at first, that this was just being sensitive, that maybe he was simply paying too much attention. But as he grew, the pattern became clearer. He began to sense things before they were spoken, like ripples on water before the stone even broke the surface. His mother would sigh in the kitchen, and before she said anything, Morty already knew what she was carrying. The exhaustion of holding a family together, the quiet longing for someone to notice her too. Summer would sit down, arms crossed, pretending to be angry, and Morty would feel the sadness underneath, long before she admitted it. Even Rick, with all his walls, could not hide entirely. Morty sensed the tiredness that lived beneath his brilliance, a tiredness so vast it seemed older than the stars. At first, this gift felt like a burden. He didn't know what to do with the feelings he gathered from others. They weren't his, but he carried them as though they were. It made his chest heavy, his mind restless. He couldn't tell anyone. How could he explain that he could hear unspoken truths not with his ears, but with something deeper? So he did the only thing he knew how. He stayed close, he listened, and he held space. Rick noticed in his own way. One evening, as Morty sat beside him in the garage while sparks danced from a half-finished invention, Rick muttered, "You're quiet tonight." Morty shrugged, not sure how to explain the storm of empathy he was feeling. Rick glanced at him, eyes narrowing with the faintest flicker of recognition. You feel too much, Morty. That's dangerous, but maybe it's also what makes you different." It was rare for Rick to say something so direct, and Morty carried those words like a secret talisman. Different. He was different, and maybe that was okay. Over time, Morty began to practice this quiet ability, though he never thought of it as practice. He found himself offering small acts, sliding his untouched sandwich towards Summer when she returned from school too drained to ask, sitting with his mother in silence when she rubbed her temples at the end of the day, holding the garage door open a little longer so Rick wouldn't feel the weight of it slamming shut. None of these gestures were large, but each carried a softness that Morty could feel ripple outward. They were his way of answering what he sensed, of giving back without demanding anything in return. At night, the flicker returned, not always on the television, but sometimes only in his dreams. The visions showed him moments where his small acts of kindness mattered more than he realized. A future Summer, smiling faintly at a memory she couldn't explain, Rick pausing in the middle of his work to recall a silence that had felt less lonely, his mother finding a trace of strength on nights she thought she had none. These glimpses reassured him that his quiet power had purpose, even if no one else ever named it. Still, there were times when Morty felt overwhelmed by it. He would walk through crowded hallways at school, brushing past dozens of lives, and each carried a weight he could almost feel pressing against him. The boy hiding anger behind jokes, the girl covering fear with laughter, the teacher masking weariness with strictness. Morty sometimes longed to shut it all out, to turn off this sensitivity like flipping a switch. But it never went away. It clung to him, shaping the way he saw the world. One evening, as he sat outside under the slow drift of clouds, Morty thought about what it meant to carry so much. He whispered softly, "Am I supposed to fix them, or just see them?" The night did not answer, but the stars seemed to shimmer with a quiet reassurance. Maybe the gift wasn't about fixing anything. Maybe it was simply about noticing, about being the kind of presence that reminded others they weren't invisible. Rick, though he would never admit it outright, began to rely on Morty's quiet power. There were nights when he returned from places he wouldn't speak about, his face pale, his eyes distant. Morty didn't ask questions. He only sat nearby, letting his presence fill the silence. Rick never thanked him, but sometimes when Morty turned away, he caught the faintest trace of softness in Rick's expression, a wordless acknowledgement that Morty's gift mattered. The truth was, Morty was becoming something Rick could never invent. His power wasn't mechanical or chemical. It didn't need wires or fuel. It was born of stillness, of listening, of carrying what others dropped without knowing. And though it was invisible, it was real enough to change the shape of his family's world, even if they never spoke about it. As days became weeks and weeks became months, Morty felt this ability growing within him like a tree, its roots quiet but steady, its branches stretching further each time he chose empathy over indifference. He didn't flaunt it. He didn't even call it a power. It was simply who he was becoming, shaped by the silences of his grandfather, the sighs of his mother, the hidden stars of his sister. That night, lying in bed, Morty thought again of the flicker. He wondered if the visions had been a warning or a gift. Perhaps both. He realized now that the screen had not been showing him something outside himself. It had been reflecting what was already there, what was waiting to bloom. He closed his eyes with this thought, letting the weight of it settle not as a burden, but as a quiet kind of destiny. And as sleep claimed him, Morty dreamed not of answers, but of holding the world gently in his hands, listening to its heartbeat and knowing that even in its vastness, his small kindnesses mattered. Summer's presence in Morty's life was a quiet, steady current, sometimes teasing, sometimes gentle, always present even when it went unnoticed. She had a way of filling rooms with energy without trying, a laugh that could puncture tension but also linger afterward like a melody. Morty, with his sensitivity to the subtle and unseen, noticed the edges of her moods long before anyone else. He could feel when her cheerfulness was a shield, when her jokes masked worry, when she needed a companion without asking for one. In these moments, he learned to be near her without suffocating, to offer space as a kind of quiet love. It began with small observations. Summer would doodle tiny stars on the corners of her notebooks, tracing the same shapes over and over, her fingers lingering on the paper as if she could press meaning into it. Morty noticed once, when no one else was watching, and didn't comment. He didn't need to. Simply seeing it made him feel connected. Over time, he began to anticipate her silences, the brief withdrawals when her thoughts became heavy. He would sit nearby, reading a book, listening to the hum of her breathing, and feel the invisible threads of her emotions intertwine with his own. There was an evening when Summer was particularly restless, pacing around the living room, muttering complaints about homework and friends. Morty sat cross-legged on the carpet, watching her with quiet patience. At some point, she stopped abruptly, tugged the blanket around her shoulders, and looked at him with wide eyes. "Morty," she said softly, "do you ever feel like everyone's pretending?" Morty didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded, feeling the truth of the words resonate in him. "Yeah," he murmured. "Sometimes it's like we're all acting in a play we didn't audition for." Summer's shoulders relaxed slightly, the tension in her hands easing. She didn't say more, and Morty didn't need her to. The shared recognition was enough. That night, Morty remembered the lullaby he had once heard in a distant dream, the soft hum of things remembered and forgotten. He hummed quietly to himself as he lay in bed, a tentative thread connecting him to something he could not name. Summer, passing by his doorway, paused and listened. Without a word, she pressed her hand lightly to his shoulder, a gesture that spoke more than sentences could. Morty felt the warmth linger long after she had gone, a small comfort echoing in the quiet spaces between their worlds. These small moments became a pattern. Morty would notice when Summer's gaze grew distant, when her laughter trembled, when her voice carried unspoken weight. He learned to respond not with words, but with presence. A sandwich left where she would find it, a quiet offering of company, a shared look of understanding across a crowded room. These acts were invisible to anyone else, but to Summer they were subtle reminders that she was seen. Morty's gift, once a source of uncertainty, now found expression in this delicate relationship. School, with its noise and chaos, became a place where Morty's attentiveness toward Summer deepened. He would walk beside her through hallways, sensing when her stride faltered, when she hesitated before speaking, when she wanted to retreat from the world. Sometimes he would simply mirror her pace, letting her feel unobserved yet accompanied. There were days when she would finally speak aloud what he had already understood, and when that happened, Morty realized that listening without interrupting could be as powerful as any advice or instruction. Even Rick, with all his brilliance and restlessness, seemed to notice the growing bond between the siblings. One evening, Morty found Rick watching them in the garage, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "You're keeping her afloat, Morty?" he said in a low tone, almost to himself. "You don't need gadgets for that. Just be there," Morty understood immediately. This was another lesson in quiet heroism, one that did not require adventure or spectacle, Only patience and presence. The lullabies, whether sung aloud or remembered from dreams, became a motif in their evenings together. Summer would sometimes hum a tune while drawing, a melody that lingered like starlight, and Morty would hum along softly, neither needing to speak, both wrapped in the warmth of unspoken understanding. Those nights were gentle, filled with a sense of continuity that balanced the chaos of their family's world. In these moments, Morty felt the threads of his empathy weave stronger, connecting him to Summer, to Rick, to their mother, to the subtle currents that shaped the household. Morty's own quiet power began to manifest more fully as he learned to anticipate not only Summer's moods, but her needs. He would fetch her notebook when it slipped from her hands, warm her soup when it cooled too quickly, shield her from small slights that others barely noticed. Each act was unremarkable to anyone else, but to Summer, it was as if he could hear the music behind her words and gently keep it from breaking. As the months passed, the bond grew in a rhythm that neither Morty nor Summer needed to define. It was built from observation, empathy, and small acts of tenderness. Morty understood that love did not always have to be dramatic. It could be quiet, continuous, resilient, and Summer, perhaps without fully realizing it, began to trust this quiet force in her brother, leaning on it in ways that required no explanation. Night returned, as it always did, soft and slow. Morty lay in bed, the flicker of the television now replaced by the warmth of connection. He thought of Summer's lullaby, of the quiet understanding between them, of the way presence could speak louder than words. The house breathed around him, carrying traces of laughter, sighs, and whispered gestures, all threading together like a gentle tapestry. And as sleep finally claimed him, Morty felt a rare certainty that in the quiet, in the noticing, in the small, invisible acts of care, he was learning the kind of power that mattered most, a power that did not demand recognition, that did not seek reward, but lived in the spaces between hearts, soft and enduring. Morty's world, already softened by the quiet bonds with Summer and the flickering presence of Rick, began to expand in subtle ways when he met someone outside the walls of his family who saw the world with the same careful attention he did. It happened on a day so ordinary that he barely noticed it at first. He was walking home from school, backpack slung over one shoulder, when he spotted an elderly man sitting on a bench at the edge of the park. His hair was thin, white like drifting clouds, and he had a small notebook balanced on his knee. He scribbled slowly, deliberately, muttering under his breath in a tone that was more like a conversation with the wind than with anyone else. Morty paused, curious but cautious. Most people his age would have hurried past, absorbed in their own worlds, but he felt an inexplicable pull toward this man. He approached quietly and asked if he could sit. The man didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his eyes held a softness, a kind of recognition that made Morty feel almost at home. "Sit," the man said, voice low and steady like a familiar lullaby. Sit and notice, and so Morty did. He noticed the way the sunlight caught the edges of the bench, the pattern of leaves drifting lazily from the trees, the faint sound of children laughing somewhere in the distance. He noticed himself noticing, and the simple act felt profound. The old man, whose name he soon learned was Mr. Harmon, nodded approvingly. "Most people walk through life without noticing anything at all," he said. "They miss the small stories hiding in plain sight." Morty felt the truth of that in his chest. He had been noticing for years, and now someone else seemed to understand why. Over the following weeks, Morty returned to the park, and the lessons unfolded in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Mr. Harmon did not give lectures or long speeches. Instead, he offered moments of attention that felt like instruction. He would hand Morty a pebble that felt smooth against his palm and ask, "What does it tell you?" Morty would watch the pebble, seeing its tiny cracks, the way it caught the light, and realized that even the smallest object could carry a story. He learned that noticing, truly noticing, was itself a kind of kindness. Sometimes Mr. Harmon would take Morty to the local grocery store or the corner cafe, places where the ordinary lives of strangers flowed past in subtle rhythms. "See how she folds the newspaper?" he said one afternoon, pointing to a woman sitting quietly with her coffee. "Notice how he hesitates before speaking to the clerk. Those pauses, those hesitations, they're full of meaning." Morty learned to read the world like a language, to find stories not in the grand gestures, but in the pauses, the small acts, the moments people didn't think anyone was watching. Rick's lessons, as chaotic and brilliant as they were, had taught Morty about science, invention, and the unpredictable patterns of the universe. Mr. Harmon's lessons were different. They were about the universe inside people, the unspoken currents that ran beneath words and actions. Morty began to understand that empathy, his quiet ability, was not just something he carried. It could be honed, strengthened, and directed. It could become a form of quiet heroism, subtle but powerful. One rainy afternoon, Morty sat under the shelter of an awning with Mr. Harmon, watching drops ripple in puddles on the sidewalk. "Sometimes," Mr. Harmon said, "people need someone to notice them. Not to fix, not to explain, not to solve, just to see. And if you can do that, Morty, you've given them a gift they can carry through storms they never thought they'd survive." Morty felt the weight and warmth of that in his chest, understanding without questioning that he had already begun to practice it, with Summer, with Rick, with his mother. But now he saw it in a broader light. It was a craft, a kind of gentle power that could touch many lives if wielded with care. The days passed, each moment layered on the last. Morty began to anticipate the needs of others without being asked. He helped neighbors carry groceries, offered quiet smiles to people who seemed burdened, listened to stories at school that might otherwise have gone unheard. His attentiveness became a rhythm, a pattern that flowed naturally from his sensitivity. And in doing so, he discovered something profound. The act of noticing was not passive. It shaped reality. It healed, subtly, almost invisibly. Even Rick, who often existed in his own orbit of brilliance and detachment, seemed to register the change. One evening, as Morty returned from the park, Rick was tinkering in the garage with his usual intensity. He glanced at Morty for a long moment, a shadow of approval passing across his eyes. Though he said nothing, Morty understood without words. Quiet power did not need announcements. Quiet power, if true, revealed itself in action, in presence, in the subtle shaping of the world around you. That night, lying in bed, Morty reflected on what he had learned. His gift of empathy, nurtured by necessity and honed by observation, had found guidance in the old man's lessons. He understood that life was full of small miracles. A smile returned, a weight lifted, a loneliness softened. And he understood, too, that he could be a vessel for those miracles, not loud or spectacular, but steady, gentle, and unwavering. Sleep came slowly that night, carrying Morty deeper into a world where empathy was a language, presence was a power, and the quiet acts of noticing and care were the truest forms of heroism. And as he drifted, he thought of Mr. Harmon, of Summer, of Rick, and the soft, luminous threads that connected them all, winding through time, space, and the gentle heartbeat of life itself. Night had fallen softly over Morty's house, thickening the world into quiet shadows and muted colors. He lay on the couch, the flicker of the television lying dormant but not forgotten, like a heartbeat waiting to be heard. The lessons from Mr. Harmon and the quiet bonds with Summer had settled into him, forming a kind of internal rhythm. Yet the memory of that first strange glow never fully faded. It lingered at the edges of his awareness, a silent invitation he couldn't resist. Tonight, he realized, might be another night for discovery. He reached for the remote, hesitating as he felt the familiar tension between curiosity and caution. The television hummed softly as he pressed the button. At first, there was only blackness, ordinary and still. Morty waited, holding his breath, and then, without warning, the screen shimmered. Light poured from it in ribbons, soft but impossibly bright, and images began to form, unfolding not as programs but as windows into possibilities. Morty saw himself, first, as a slightly older version, wandering through a library that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. He walked alone at first, then slowly, the library filled with people, some familiar, some strangers. He watched himself laugh with summer in this imagined world, not the teasing or impatient smiles of reality, but the kind of shared laughter that felt timeless. He saw Rick, quiet and thoughtful, not distracted by machines or chaos, simply watching over him with an expression that balanced pride and concern. The vision shifted, delicate and fluid. Morty saw himself standing beside his mother on a rainy afternoon, handing her an umbrella with a small, knowing smile. He watched as her eyes softened, a rare moment of peace rippling across her face. Then the images changed again, a dimly lit room, shadows stretching long across walls, Morty alone, reflecting on choices that had not yet been made, doors not yet opened. The television did not comment or judge. It only showed gently, like a mirror holding possibilities. Each scene carried a quiet lesson. Morty saw how small gestures, the hand offered, the words held back, the choice to stay and listen, could shift the course of a life, not dramatically, but profoundly. He saw the same paths diverge over and over, a choice made, a gesture missed, a conversation left unsaid. And through it all, he realized the flicker was not magic alone. It was a reflection of him. His awareness, his empathy, his quiet attentiveness, the gifts he had cultivated, were shaping every possibility, every potential future. The more he watched, the more he understood the depth of connection between action and consequence. He saw himself comforting Summer in worlds where she was lonely, guiding Rick in moments of hesitation, listening to his mother without interruption. And in these visions he saw a thread that wove through all paths. Presence mattered more than achievement, understanding more than knowledge, compassion more than applause. The television's glow confirmed what he had already felt, a quiet truth unfolding before him in light and shadow. Some windows were darker, showing choices that led to isolation, frustration, or regret. Morty felt the sting of these moments, as if they were real, the weight pressing gently on his chest. But he did not turn away. He knew these possibilities existed to teach, to warn, and to illuminate the power of even the smallest decisions. He began to notice patterns, subtle motifs that repeated across realities, a sandwich shared, a hand held, a listening ear. These were not grand gestures, not heroic feats, but they resonated more deeply than any spectacle could. Hours passed, though Morty did not measure them. The television became less a device and more a companion, offering lessons without words. It reflected the ripple of his choices, magnifying the quiet impact he had on the world around him. He understood that while he could not control everything, he could cultivate presence, empathy, and attentiveness, qualities that shaped the texture of every life he touched. In one final vision, before sleep claimed him, Morty saw a room filled with laughter, tears, whispered conversations, and the soft comfort of ordinary moments. Rick smiled faintly, Summer's hand brushed his, and his mother's eyes glistened with understanding. Morty felt the warmth of possibility, the quiet affirmation that he was capable of nurturing these connections, of leaving a gentle imprint on the world through attention and care. The images faded slowly, leaving only the soft hum of the television and the quiet pulse of his own heart. Morty closed his eyes, letting the lessons sink deeper, not as knowledge to memorize, but as a feeling to carry forward. He understood that life offered countless windows into possible lives, but it was presence, attentiveness, and subtle courage that shaped which paths were worth walking. And as sleep wrapped around him, carrying him into dream after dream, Morty felt a sense of anticipation not for adventure or spectacle, but for the simple, enduring work of being fully present, quietly noticing, and gently shaping the lives of those he loved. The possibilities were endless, but he had the power to inhabit them thoughtfully, with care, and with love. The mornings grew quieter in a way that felt deliberate, as though the world itself had slowed to allow Morty to notice. He carried the lessons of the television, and Mr. Harmon like soft armor, aware that his gift, his ability to feel and hold the unspoken, was both a treasure and a burden. The gift shimmered in the spaces between people, in the subtle weight of a sigh, the hesitation of a glance, the tremor of an unvoiced thought. And as much as he had practiced empathy, he began to realize that carrying others' emotions was not always light work. It happened first with Summer. She had returned from school one afternoon, her shoulders hunched, eyes distant. Morty noticed it before she spoke, a tension that pressed against the quiet of their home like invisible ink. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator a soft backdrop. "Hey," he said gently. "Want to talk?" Summer shook her head, a single motion heavy with refusal, and Morty felt the weight of her sadness settle around him. It was not just her own. It was the echoes of frustration, loneliness, and small fears that had built up over weeks. He breathed slowly, letting himself hold it without judgment. He learned quickly that empathy was not always a solution. Some emotions could not be fixed with a word or a gesture. Some sorrow had to be carried, shared silently, until it dissolved on its own. Morty sat with Summer without pressing further, letting the quiet speak for him. He held space as Mr. Harmon had taught him, and over time the tension in her shoulders softened, the eyes no longer distant, though the sadness remained, tempered by the fact that someone else could feel it with her. At school, Morty began to notice similar patterns in others. A classmate muttering to themselves in the hallway, a teacher sighing mid-lecture, a friend laughing a little too loudly. He felt the invisible currents that connected all of them, fragile and delicate. He began to understand the limits of his own endurance. There were moments when the emotions pressed against him, heavy and relentless, until he felt as though he might break. But with each instance, he learned to recognize the difference between what he could carry and what he could only observe. Rick's presence complicated the balance further. The chaos and brilliance of his grandfather often left Morty reeling, even as he learned from it. One evening, Rick returned home later than usual, disheveled, muttering calculations that Morty could not follow. He sensed the weight of Rick's restlessness, the exhaustion lurking beneath the fire of his intelligence. Morty wanted to speak, to ease it somehow, but he knew words would be insufficient. So he sat in quiet, letting Rick's energy pulse in the room without pressing or retreating. After a long moment, Rick slumped slightly, letting out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Morty understood then that empathy was sometimes silent endurance as much as action. The television flicker returned on a rainy night, soft and insistent, images forming like echoes of paths not yet traveled. Morty watched himself in countless scenarios, standing up for someone who felt unseen, comforting a friend in grief, pausing to listen when a teacher needed a wordless companion. And alongside these acts were the harder images, him turning away from suffering, failing to hold a presence, moments of fatigue that made his chest ache. The visions were not punitive, only reflective, and Morty absorbed the lesson without judgment. Empathy was a living practice, one that required attention, courage, and sometimes endurance. He began experimenting with ways to protect himself while remaining open. He would pause before entering a room, breathing slowly, sensing the weight he might encounter. He learned to differentiate between sorrow he could soften and the emotions that belonged to others, needing only acknowledgement, not solution. He practiced letting the heaviness flow around him like water rather than pressing into him like stone. These were subtle exercises, often unnoticed by anyone else, but essential for the careful cultivation of his gift. Summer, quietly resilient, sometimes noticed his subtle shifts. One night, she placed a hand on his arm and whispered, "Thanks for just being here." Morty felt the warmth of her acknowledgement ripple through him, not lightening the weight of all emotions he carried, but giving him affirmation that his presence mattered. It was a reminder that empathy was a dialogue, not a burden, that carrying the invisible did not always mean suffering alone. Even Rick, with his restless mind and complicated love, began to acknowledge Morty in ways that were unspoken. A small nod as he passed, a rare smile in the garage, a moment of hesitation before leaving, a recognition that Morty's quiet attention had shaped the household in ways even he could not articulate. Morty understood more than ever that power could be subtle, influence could be gentle, and heroism could reside entirely in endurance and care. As nights grew longer and the hum of the house softened into the rhythm of sleep, Morty practiced resting alongside the emotions he could not release. He allowed himself to feel the echoes without absorbing them fully, cultivating the balance between presence and self-preservation. He dreamed of paths where he carried others lightly, of worlds where empathy could ripple outward without breaking him, and of the quiet transformations that waited in invisible spaces. And as he drifted into sleep, wrapped in blankets and the lingering warmth of presence, Morty understood a new truth, that holding others' hearts required a careful balance, a patient rhythm, and unwavering attention. It was not an easy gift, but it was a necessary one. And somewhere deep inside, he felt certain that it was shaping him into the kind of person who could touch the world, softly but profoundly in ways no one could measure, yet everyone could feel. Morty began to notice the subtle moments when presence alone was not enough, when observation and empathy needed to meet action. It started in the school hallway, where he saw a younger student crouched behind a locker, trembling, clutching a notebook to her chest. Her friends were loud and careless nearby, their laughter cutting through the air like sharp edges. Morty felt the girl's fear pressing against him, a quiet weight that begged for acknowledgement. He hesitated only a moment before stepping closer, his voice calm and unassuming. "Hey, are you okay?" The girl looked up, eyes wide and uncertain, and for the first time in that day, someone's gaze met hers with recognition, not ridicule. He didn't make a spectacle. He didn't scold her peers or demand attention. He simply stayed beside her, offering a hand, a shoulder, and quiet words. And in that moment, Morty realized something he had only glimpsed in visions. Courage did not always roar. Sometimes courage whispered, moved gently, and acted quietly in the spaces where fear lingered. The girl's shoulders relaxed imperceptibly, her breath steadied, and Morty felt the first ripple of change. The lesson repeated itself in smaller, subtler ways over the days. He noticed when Rick became unusually silent in the garage, lost in a problem that weighed on him more than usual. Morty offered a presence that was not intrusive, leaving a notebook of ideas for him to explore, a simple gesture that acknowledged both Rick's genius and his weariness. Rick didn't thank him aloud, but later, a glance and a small nod sufficed. Action did not need recognition. It only needed to be thoughtful. Summer, ever perceptive, began to notice the shifts in her brother as well. One evening they sat on the porch watching the sky fade into soft hues of indigo and gold. Morty had returned from the park where he sometimes accompanied Mr. Harmon, and his thoughts were still tuned to the subtleties of the world around him. Summer nudged him lightly, teasing, "You've been acting different."
Like more
Deliberate. Morty smiled faintly, thinking about how he had begun to combine his awareness with gentle action, how noticing and responding were no longer separate. "Maybe," he said softly. "Sometimes noticing is just the first step. You have to step forward too." Summer's eyes softened, a rare moment of understanding passing between them without words. Morty began to see the same interplay of empathy and action in his own home. His mother often carried invisible burdens, and he found ways to ease them without fanfare. A cup of tea left on the counter, a soft knock before entering a room, helping with small chores she never asked for. Each action was grounded in awareness, guided by understanding, and executed without expectation. The rhythm of quiet courage settled into him, a natural extension of the empathy he had honed over years. Rick's own actions became an unintended teacher. Morty observed how his grandfather, despite brilliance and stubbornness, often stepped into the chaos of life to fix what others could not, yet always seemed exhausted by the weight of doing so alone. Morty understood now that courage was not the absence of fear or fatigue. It was the decision to act despite them, to offer what one could even when the path was uncertain. He began to combine this understanding with his quiet power, testing the limits gently, responding with small interventions that mattered more than the grand gestures Rick often relied on. The television flicker returned in the evenings, showing him windows into alternate possibilities, but now he watched differently. He saw versions of himself taking timid steps, standing back when action was needed, letting opportunities pass, and he saw other versions leaning in, reaching out and acting with subtle courage. Morty realized that the choices he made in his ordinary world, the presence, the small acts of kindness, the gentle attentiveness, were shaping not only the lives around him, but the possibilities of who he could become. One rainy afternoon, a minor crisis at school tested this lesson. A group of younger students had gotten lost during a field trip, their panic mounting in the crowded corridors of the museum. Morty felt the anxiety in the air, in the whispers and hurried movements, and he stepped forward. He guided the children calmly, his voice soft, grounding them without alarm, drawing on every lesson from Mr. Harmon, Summer, and the echoes of the flickering television visions. When the group was safely returned, Morty's chest ached not from heroics, but from relief, the relief of using empathy to guide action, of being present and effective without seeking recognition. That night, as Morty lay in bed, the rhythm of quiet courage settled like a gentle tide within him. He reflected on the small victories and the lessons etched into his days. Noticing alone was not enough, empathy alone was not enough, but together they created the power to touch lives. And he understood, more clearly than ever, that courage did not have to be loud or dramatic. It could reside in the quiet heart of ordinary moments, in the gentle persistence of kindness and understanding. Impossible to ignore. He dressed slowly, aware that the day would demand more than observation alone. School offered its usual tide of small challenges, but Morty found himself moving through it with a quiet patience honed over months of practice. He noticed the fatigue of a teacher lingering behind their eyes, the tremor of anxiety in a classmate's voice, the muted joy in someone else's laughter. And he carried these things lightly, learning to hold them without being overwhelmed, allowing the weight to teach rather than consume. At lunch, Summer slid onto the bench beside him, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. Morty sensed her excitement, something new and tender, a small triumph she did not know how to share. "Hey," he said softly, "something good happen?" She nodded, eyes shining.
Yeah, just stuff at school.
"You'd get it if you were there." Morty listened without pressing, giving her the space to let the feeling exist. He understood now that the gift of attention was not always intervention. Sometimes it was the simple acknowledgement, the gentle witness of another's joy or sorrow. That afternoon, the television flicker returned in its quiet way, not demanding but offering, as if it sensed Morty's readiness. The images were subtler than before, no fantastical alternate realities, no explosive colors or impossible inventions, but ordinary moments amplified, a stranger offering a seat, a neighbor returning a lost wallet, a child comforting a sibling. Morty watched, seeing how small gestures of care shaped ripples that stretched far beyond immediate perception, and he realized that this was not just guidance, it was affirmation. His quiet courage, his attentive presence, the weight of his empathy was meaningful. Yet carrying the emotions of others was not without challenge. That evening, Rick returned from one of his restless excursions, looking older in the dim garage light. Morty felt the edges of Rick's exhaustion, the tension coiling like thin wires in the air. He wanted to offer help, but words seemed insufficient. Instead, he moved closer, standing silently as Rick tinkered, letting his presence provide a subtle anchor. Hours passed, and Rick did not speak a word of acknowledgement, yet Morty felt the shift in energy, the tension softened, the hum of the garage felt warmer. Empathy combined with careful action could ease burdens quietly. Later, as the household settled into the soft rhythm of evening, Morty found his mother in the kitchen, her hands busy with dishes but her shoulders heavy. He placed a glass of water beside her, letting it remain without comment, a small offering of thoughtfulness. She glanced up, catching his eye for a brief moment, a silent "thank you" passing between them. Morty realized that the weight he carried was not solely his burden, it was also a bridge, a connection that reminded others they were seen, they were felt, they mattered. He began to notice a subtle pattern forming in himself. The heavier the emotional weight he carried, the more attuned he became to beauty in small, ordinary acts. The fold of a newspaper, the careful way Summer organized her books, the soft hum of Mr. Harmon's pen on paper, they all became markers of life's quiet significance. Morty understood that while empathy could be demanding, it also offered access to moments of subtle grace, to connections that were profound precisely because they were gentle and unassuming. That night, he sat by the window, rain pattering softly on the glass. He thought about the paradox he was learning to navigate. The weight of others' emotions pressed against him, but within that pressure lay meaning, purpose, and even a strange joy. He could be a witness, a presence, and sometimes a guide, all without fanfare or recognition. He realized that the challenge was not simply in carrying the emotions themselves, but in balancing them with his own inner needs,
learning to breathe amidst the currents, to hold without absorbing fully,
to touch without being consumed. In dreams, the lesson continued. Morty saw himself moving through worlds both familiar and strange, holding hands, offering smiles, pausing to listen, stepping forward when action was required. And in each vision the weight was present, but it no longer felt crushing. It felt like a tether to life, a reminder that every small gesture mattered. Every act of attentiveness shaped not only others' lives but his own. He drifted deeper into sleep with the serene understanding that the gift of empathy was also a gift of connection, and that even in carrying the world's quiet burdens, he was shaping something luminous and enduring. As the night deepened, Morty exhaled slowly, feeling the delicate balance between responsibility and presence settle into his bones. He understood now that the weight and the gift were inseparable. The heaviness of caring gave rise to meaning. The subtle heroism of quiet acts rippled beyond immediate sight, and the connections formed through empathy were the most enduring legacies he could ever leave. The days grew longer, and Morty began to notice the subtle consequences of his quiet interventions, small ripples spreading through the currents of his home and school life. One morning, he passed a classmate in the hallway who had been struggling with loneliness. The boy's eyes met his briefly, and Morty saw a flicker of recognition, a sense of being seen. Morty didn't speak, didn't offer advice. He simply nodded, a gesture that carried more weight than words. Later, that same boy shared a joke with others, the laughter lighter, less strained than before. Morty realized the ripples of empathy moved farther than he could always perceive, touching lives indirectly, yet profoundly. Summer noticed them too, though she expressed it differently. She began leaving little notes for Morty, a doodled star here, a smiley face there, a word of thanks for something he had done without comment. The gestures were small, yet to Morty they carried the resonance of acknowledgement, of shared understanding. He learned that ripples could travel in silence, that influence did not require speech or spectacle, only consistent, mindful presence. Rick, as always, remained a complicated element in the household. Morty began observing how even his grandfather's brusque, chaotic interventions were subtly shaped by the environment Morty was quietly cultivating. A neighbor offered assistance to Rick without complaint. A friend hesitated less before sharing ideas in the garage. Even Rick's inventions began to reflect a slower, more thoughtful rhythm, tempered by the currents of care Morty's attentiveness had established. Morty understood that influence was rarely immediate or visible. It unfolded over time, layered, delicate, persistent. The television flicker appeared less frequently now, almost as if it were approving of his development. When it did, it showed not dramatic or impossible worlds, but ordinary ones. A neighbor returned a lost cat, a friend comforted someone without a word, a sibling helped another carry a burden unnoticed. Morty observed, taking note of patterns, realizing that each small act compounded into a network of subtle changes. It reinforced a lesson he had begun to live. Heroism was quiet, ripple-driven, patient. The power of influence lay not in grand gestures, but in consistent, gentle attention. One rainy afternoon, Morty found a lost puppy shivering in the corner of the park. Its eyes were wide with fear, its body trembling. Morty knelt beside it, speaking softly, his hand resting on the damp fur. He guided it toward the warmth of a nearby shelter, taking care not to startle it, noticing every shiver, every flick of the tail. The staff at the shelter barely noticed his presence, yet later that day, one of the volunteers mentioned the puppy had been calm, comforted, thanks to the gentle guidance of a stranger. Morty smiled quietly to himself, realizing that even small, unnoticed gestures could ripple outward in ways he could not always measure. At home, he began noticing subtler shifts in Summer and his mother as well. Summer became more patient with herself and others, her laughter carrying a newfound warmth. His mother moved through her day with less fatigue, her burdens subtly eased by unspoken acts of care, meals left ready, chores taken quietly off her shoulders, presence without intrusion. Morty saw that influence was rarely immediate or visible. It was cumulative, a collection of gentle touches that shaped perception and experience over time. Even his own internal world was shifting. Morty discovered a calm within himself that had not been there before. The pressure of carrying others' emotions, once heavy and sometimes overwhelming, had become a practice of balance. He could sense the flow of feelings, step into them when needed, and retreat when necessary, like waves moving across a quiet sea. Empathy and action, he realized, were inseparable, yet distinct. Noticing without acting left a hollow ache, acting without noticing risked harm. True mastery, he saw, required both, integrated with patience, observation, and care. Rick, though still unpredictable, occasionally paused in recognition of Morty's growth. A nod, a brief glance, a rare, good work muttered under his breath. Small acknowledgements that carried weight because they were unexpected. Morty understood that the ripples he generated were influencing even those most resistant to change, and that sometimes the quietest acts left the deepest impact. An immediate perception. And in that understanding, A new peace settled over him, a sense that even ordinary days could contain profound significance when lived with attention, courage, and quiet intention. As sleep drew him into dreams, Morty felt the subtle satisfaction of continuity, that his quiet courage and empathy were not fleeting, but living threads woven into the tapestry of his life and the lives around him. He dreamed of worlds full of small acts that mattered, of laughter quietly returned, burdens gently lifted, connections strengthened without recognition. And in that dreaming, he found the affirmation of purpose. The ripples of his presence would continue, far beyond what he could ever see, shaping life in ways soft, enduring, and profoundly human. The mornings began to stretch longer, carrying a quiet weight of possibility in their gentle light. Morty had grown accustomed to observing the world in layers, noticing not just what was said or done, but what lingered beneath, shaping everything in subtle, unseen ways. He had learned that empathy was a language of present, that courage could whisper rather than roar, and that even the smallest ripple of care could transform a moment, a day, a life. Now he found himself beginning to see the horizon beyond his immediate world, where all these lessons converged into something larger. It started with the park, where the rhythm of daily life was a slow, breathing pulse. Morty noticed neighbors exchanging small courtesies, children helping one another climb slides, a mother watching her child with tender patience. The patterns, once invisible to him, now revealed themselves like gentle currents, showing how ordinary actions carried consequences far beyond the eye. Morty began to realize that the influence he carried in his own life, through quiet attention, small acts of courage, and consistent empathy, was part of a broader tapestry that connected everyone in subtle ways. He experimented intentionally, stepping beyond personal concern to consider the wider world. At school, he noticed a student struggling with math, anxiety written across every movement. Morty offered a patient explanation, guiding without judgment, noticing when frustration threatened to take over, and gently redirecting focus. Later, he saw the same student offering help to a younger classmate, teaching with patience, learned through Morty's quiet guidance. It was a small, almost imperceptible chain, yet Morty felt it profoundly. Influence was cumulative, often unseen, but endlessly impactful. Summer joined him in these observations, a silent partner in noticing and reflecting. One evening, as they walked home beneath the soft glow of streetlights, she commented, "It's weird, Morty. I feel like everything we do matters, even the tiny stuff." He nodded, understanding the gravity behind her casual words. "Yeah. Even when we can't see it, the world is shaped by the little choices we make." They walked in silence after that, noticing the soft flicker of windows in houses, the distant hum of traffic, the quiet life pressing gently through the streets. Rick remained, as ever a paradox in Morty's expanding perspective. His brilliance was chaotic, disruptive, yet under it, Morty began to see traces of deliberate care. A neighbor's stray cat returned home, a friend's problem solved with minimal fuss, subtle shifts in energy that reflected Rick's inadvertent guidance. Morty realized that influence was not only a matter of conscious action, it could emerge from consistent presence, even when intentions were messy or unspoken. He began to see the larger horizon of connection, how his actions intertwined with Rick's, Summer's, and countless others, forming patterns beyond immediate perception. The television flicker appeared that night, softer than ever, more reflective. It no longer showed impossible worlds, but familiar ones imbued with resonance. Morty watched images of small kindnesses amplified over time, a lost child found because someone paused to notice, a quarrel eased through listening, an act of courage inspiring another across days or weeks. The visions were neither spectacular nor urgent, but they carried clarity. Life's meaning resided not in grand gestures, but in persistent, quiet, deliberate attentiveness. Morty's reflections deepened as he observed his own household. The small habits he had cultivated, the glass of water for his mother, gentle guidance for Summer, patient attention to Rick, were beginning to shape not only moments, but the rhythms of their lives. Patterns of kindness and patience repeated, looping back in unexpected ways like echoes in a softly resonant room. Morty realized that understanding this interplay was the horizon he had been moving toward, the full picture of how empathy, courage, and quiet action could ripple outward, subtly transforming entire environments. He spent hours walking through the neighborhood, noticing how gestures, shared umbrellas in rain, a wave to a lonely neighbor, picking up litter that someone else had dropped, cascaded, unseen yet persistent. Each ripple carried the same essence. Small attention created connection, connection nurtured courage, and courage enabled further action. Morty recognized that he was both participant and observer, a node in a living network of care whose influence extended far beyond his immediate perception. At home, the quiet settled into a rhythm that felt like harmony. Rick tinkered in the garage, Summer sketched stories in her notebook, and Morty moved through the house with deliberate presence, offering attention, kindness, and subtle support wherever it was needed. He began to notice that the horizon he had glimpsed, the broader resonance of his quiet actions, was not a distant goal, but an ongoing practice, a living pattern to be sustained with mindfulness, patience, and awareness. That night, lying in bed, Morty traced the day's subtle ripples in his mind. He thought about all the invisible threads connecting people, the ways in which empathy, courage, and quiet action converged to shape lives in ways he could not always measure. He understood more fully than ever that the weight he carried was inseparable from the gift he offered, and that his presence alone could create meaning in the world. As he drifted towards sleep, the horizon of understanding unfurled softly before him, luminous yet gentle, a reminder that life's impact is measured not in grandiosity, but in the quiet, persistent shaping of hearts and minds, and somewhere, deep in the currents of dreams, Morty imagined all those ripples continuing, extending beyond time, touching lives in ways small, subtle and profoundly enduring. The horizon was vast, and yet he felt at peace walking within it, carrying both weight and gift, ready to shape the world through quiet attention and deliberate, gentle courage. The night sky stretched above Morty's house like a soft, endless canopy dotted with stars that pulsed faintly, as if breathing in rhythm with the world below. Morty lay on the grass behind the house, feeling the cool earth press gently against his back, his mind tracing the ripples of days past, the quiet acts of courage, the tender attentiveness, the empathy that had begun to shape everything he touched. It was here, beneath the calm weight of the night, that he allowed himself to reflect fully on the journey he had taken and the subtle ways in which he had grown. Summer joined him quietly, carrying a small thermos of warm tea. She sat cross-legged, her eyes scanning the stars without speaking at first. Morty felt the comfort of her presence beside him, a quiet acknowledgement that understanding did not always need words. "You've changed," she said softly, finally breaking the silence. Morty smiled faintly, feeling the truth in her observation. "Maybe," he replied. "Or maybe I just see a little more of what's already there." Summer nodded, and they sat together in shared quiet, letting the sky above and the rhythm of their breathing carry the moment. The flicker of the television, which had guided him for so long, seemed unnecessary tonight. Morty realized that the lessons it offered, the weight of empathy, the importance of quiet courage, the ripple of small actions, had become internalized. He could sense the threads connecting himself, his family, and even the world beyond the yard. Each small gesture of care had accumulated into patterns of influence, gentle yet persistent, invisible yet deeply felt. He saw how his presence had shaped his mother's patience, Summer's laughter, Rick's occasional stillness, and even classmates' fleeting smiles. These reflections carried a serenity that words could barely touch. In the quiet, Morty thought of Rick's complex ways, the brilliance and chaos that had once seemed overwhelming. He understood now that even in Rick's loud interventions, there were glimpses of careful influence, echoes of consideration buried beneath the storm. Morty realized that legacy in all its forms was rarely dramatic. It was composed of choices made in attentiveness, moments where courage whispered instead of shouted, where empathy softened rather than corrected. His grandfather's life, like his own, was a tapestry of subtle threads, each significant because it touched another life in a small, meaningful way. Morty's thoughts drifted to the broader world. He considered the connections he could not see, the way a smile, a word, or an act of kindness might ripple outward, unnoticed, affecting countless others. It was humbling, almost overwhelming, to feel the weight and reach of these invisible threads. Yet it was also beautiful. Morty realized that every act of empathy and courage, no matter how small, contributed to a larger harmony, a quiet shaping of reality that unfolded across days, weeks, and perhaps years. He recalled the small moments that had shaped him most, the trembling child in the hallway, the lost puppy, the laughter shared quietly with Summer, the silent acknowledgement of his mother's fatigue. These were not heroic deeds in the usual sense, yet they carried significance beyond measure. Morty understood with gentle certainty that the measure of influence was not visibility or acclaim, but the depth of care invested and the persistence of its effects. The quiet heroism he had cultivated was not flashy or celebrated, but enduring. The night deepened, stars shifting imperceptibly across the sky. Morty felt a soft exhale pass through him, a release of tension he had carried for years, replaced by an internal calm. He allowed himself to recognize the fullness of the journey, the lessons learned, the connections forged, the courage exercised in quiet moments.
Legacy, he realized, was not a monument or a headline,
but a living presence in the hearts of those touched by gentle attention, empathy, and mindful action. Summer rested her head on her knees, and Morty turned slightly to watch her breathing settle into rhythm. In the stillness, he felt the fullness of what he had become, a conduit for care, a quiet guardian of moments that mattered, a participant in the unspoken networks of influence that shaped life. He recognized that the weight he carried, the emotions of others, the responsibility of presence, was inseparable from the gift it offered. Each breath, each gesture, each attentive moment contributed to a life that was quietly heroic in ways unseen. Morty's eyes drifted upward again, to the infinite expanse above, and he thought of all the possibilities yet to come. He felt a gentle wonder, a reverent awe at the ordinary yet profound currents of life in which he had learned to participate. The horizon of understanding, once distant and abstract, had become immediate and living within him. He was aware, present, and deeply attuned to the subtle symphony of connection and care that threaded through the world. And somewhere, far beyond his immediate perception, the ripples of his quiet courage and empathy continued to unfold. Morty let himself exhale fully, letting the weight of awareness settle into serenity. He felt the continuity of life, the resonance of small acts, and the enduring presence of care, a gentle affirmation that all he had practiced, all he had nurtured, mattered in ways both visible and invisible. As sleep drew him into its embrace, Morty let his mind soften, thoughts drifting like clouds across the night sky. He reflected on the journey from uncertainty to understanding, from observing to acting, from carrying weight to embracing the gift within it. He felt a quiet peace, a luminous calm, and a deep connection to the world he had learned to inhabit thoughtfully, tenderly, and with purpose, and with that, Morty stretched into the stars. The night carried Morty's thoughts far beyond the backyard, as if the stars themselves had extended an invitation to step into something larger, something still unfolding. Sleep had touched him only lightly, wrapping him in half-dreams where memories blended with possibilities, and voices whispered not from outside, but from within. He awoke before dawn, not restless but charged, his chest holding the quiet pulse of realization that what he had begun was not finished. Legacy was not an endpoint, it was a continuum, one he was already shaping, but still needed to understand more deeply. The sky was painted in soft strokes of grey and violet as Morty stepped back into the yard, the air cool against his skin. The grass, damp with dew, brushed against his ankles as he walked slowly, tracing a path without clear destination. He carried no television this time, no external guide. His awareness itself had become the screen upon which lessons appeared, reflections unfolding with each step. He could feel the threads of connection he had nurtured, stretching outward like unseen roots, feeding into spaces he could not touch directly, yet somehow belonged to. Summer emerged quietly from the house, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. She didn't speak, simply joining Morty in his slow walk. The silence between them was different now, less tentative, more like a language they both knew. Morty glanced at her, recognizing in her posture the same awareness he carried, that they were standing on the edge of something new, something fragile, yet powerful. It was not just about them as siblings or even about their family. It was about stepping into the current of continuity, the unbroken chain of influence that stretched both behind and ahead of them. Their mother's voice floated faintly from the kitchen window, humming a tune as she prepared breakfast. The sound was soft, unremarkable, yet it struck Morty with the weight of meaning. He realized how these small, ordinary acts, her patience in the morning, her effort to hold the family steady, were legacies too. They were lessons etched not in grand declarations but in constancy. Morty felt gratitude rise in him, quiet yet profound, and he wondered how many times he had overlooked these gestures before his awareness sharpened. He understood now, nothing was small when viewed through the lens of legacy. Rick entered the yard not long after, a faint smell of smoke clinging to his coat, his eyes heavy with the residue of sleepless invention. He looked at Morty for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then, without a word, he dropped into a chair on the porch, leaning back and letting his gaze wander skyward. Morty didn't press him. He simply acknowledged Rick's presence as part of the unfolding tapestry. The silence, once awkward and burdened, now carried weight of a different kind. It was permission, a recognition that understanding did not need to be forced. The morning grew brighter,
light spilling over rooftops, awakening the world around them.
Morty felt the shift inwardly, a call to carry what he had learned into spaces beyond his home. Legacy could not remain contained in one backyard or one family. It had to stretch outward, touching classmates, neighbors, strangers whose lives intersected his in fleeting but real ways. He imagined walking into school again, not with the heaviness of obligation, but with the awareness that every interaction mattered. A smile, a word of encouragement, even the restraint of judgment, all were choices shaping futures in ways unseen. Later that day, Morty did just that. He moved through hallways he had once dreaded with a different presence, no longer hunched by invisibility, but softened by awareness. When a student fumbled with books at a locker, he bent to help without hesitation. When laughter threatened to wound rather than uplift, he chose silence instead of participation. These moments passed quickly, unnoticed by most, but Morty carried them as proof of continuity. He saw in them the living echo of the lessons he had received. translated now into his own actions, extending threads outward. As he sat in class, listening not only to words, but to the subtle shifts of tone and expression, Morty realized something deeper. Influence was not only about what he offered, it was about what he absorbed, what he allowed to shape him in return. Legacy was not one-directional. It was a dialogue, a mutual exchange where giving and receiving were inseparable. He thought of his teachers, each carrying their own silent burdens, and felt empathy extend toward them. They too were shaping futures in ways they might never witness, and Morty saw himself as part of that unbroken chain. The day unfolded with gentle clarity, and when Morty returned home, he felt both tired and renewed. Summer met him at the door, a knowing look in her eyes as though she could sense the quiet acts he had carried with him. Their mother's laughter drifted from the living room, and Rick's tools clattered faintly in the garage. Each sound, each presence, wove into the fabric of continuity Morty now recognized so vividly. He felt himself not as a separate thread, but as part of the whole, inseparable and necessary. That night, lying again beneath the stars, Morty's reflections deepened. He saw clearly how his journey was not about reaching an end, but about sustaining a way of being. Legacy was alive in every moment, and it required tending like a flame, never forceful, never blinding, but steady, persistent, illuminating quietly. He imagined the countless others across the world carrying their own quiet flames, each one small alone but immense together. The thought filled him with awe and a sense of belonging that stretched far beyond his small corner of existence. Sleep touched him slowly.
Gently, but not before he whispered into the night, not to anyone in particular,
but to the continuum itself. I'll keep carrying this, I promise. And the stars above, ancient witnesses to countless promises, seemed to flicker in agreement. The promise Morty whispered into the night did not dissolve with sleep. It stayed with him, carried in the rhythm of his breath, and when morning came, it rose alongside him, quiet but insistent. He moved through the day with a steadiness that felt unfamiliar, yet natural, as though something deep within him had finally settled. The air seemed sharper, details clearer, the way sunlight filtered through the blinds, the faint creak of the stairs beneath his feet, even the muffled hum of Rick tinkering in the garage. Everything belonged, every sound and moment part of the continuum he had pledged to uphold. Breakfast unfolded in its usual mess of clinking dishes and half-spoken conversations, but Morty noticed the subtle ways connection threaded through the noise. His mother set down plates with a weariness in her shoulders, yet still managed to smile when Summer made a small joke. Rick muttered about circuitry, brushing crumbs from his lap absent-mindedly, while Summer scrolled on her phone with the faintest curve of a grin. Morty realized these ordinary mornings, so easily dismissed, were the foundation of something enduring. Continuity was not found only in grand revelations, but in these fragile, repeated rituals. At school, the day stretched long, yet Morty felt no heaviness in its passing. He sat through lectures with attention not only on the words, but on the currents. Beneath them, the way a teacher's voice softened when describing a difficult concept, or the spark of curiosity in a classmate's eyes when something finally clicked. Each moment revealed the flow of influence, the ways people gave and received without always recognizing it. Morty felt himself part of a living pattern, small but essential. He no longer searched for significance. He simply lived it, step by step, interaction by interaction. But as clarity deepened, so did the weight of responsibility. Walking home beneath a sky stretched with clouds, Morty sensed the immensity of what he had embraced. To carry continuity was not to shine only in rare moments, it was to remain steady even when tired, even when unseen. Legacy did not wait for applause. It demanded presence when no one noticed. Morty felt a quiet tremor within him, the realization that this promise was not a fleeting thought, but a lifelong task. For a moment, doubt pressed against his chest. What if he faltered? What if the weight became too much? Rick was waiting in the garage when Morty returned, not with an invention in his hands, but with silence. He sat hunched over, a bottle at his side untouched, his gaze lost in the clutter of half-finished machines. Morty hesitated, then stepped closer. Rick glanced up briefly, their eyes meeting, and for the first time there was no sarcasm, no shield, only a tired acknowledgement of something unspoken. Morty didn't fill the silence with questions or comfort. He simply sat down beside him, their breaths sinking in the quiet. Continuity, Morty realized, sometimes meant just being there, offering presence when words were too heavy. As evening drew near, Summer joined them in the garage, her presence bringing a fragile warmth. She didn't tease or press either of them. Instead, she leaned against the workbench, scrolling idly through her phone, but glancing up now and then, her quiet loyalty wrapping around the room. For a brief, fragile moment, the family existed together without conflict, bound by something deeper than words. Morty felt it like a pulse, an invisible thread holding them all, messy and fractured as they were, in the same orbit. It wasn't perfection, but it was real, and it was theirs. Later, beneath the night sky, Morty found himself lying in the grass once more, the stars stretching endlessly above. The cool air brushed against his skin, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and the distant sound of crickets. He thought about the countless lives unfolding beneath the same stars, each carrying its own quiet burdens, each shaping futures they might never witness. The immensity of it both overwhelmed and steadied him. His promise, small as it seemed, was not insignificant. It joined a chorus of promises made by others, threads weaving into a vast, unseen tapestry. As he closed his eyes, Morty felt the faint hum of continuity alive in his chest, no longer something external but part of his very being. The weight of doubt lingered still, but it no longer threatened to undo him. He understood now. Faltering was not failure. Continuity lived in the effort, in the returning, in the steady choice to rise again and again. Legacy was not about perfection. It was about persistence, about carrying the flame even when it flickered. Sleep came gently, and with it, dreams not of escape, but of return. He saw himself walking through familiar halls, sitting at cluttered tables, standing beneath infinite skies, all the ordinary places of his life, each one shining faintly with meaning. The dream carried no urgency, no chaos, only the steady rhythm of belonging. When Morty stirred awake in the early hours, the promise still pulsed in him, quiet and unwavering. He whispered again into the silence, softer this time, not as a vow to the universe, but as a reminder to himself, I'll keep carrying this. And in the stillness, as though the world itself heard him, the night seemed to lean closer, holding his words in place.